Okay,
there?
I guess we're there.
Okay, right
Yep,
after,
we'll leave your
turn
seat
left
in
at the
the-
microphone.
turn left?
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Okay, V.
So we're not sure exactly what happened. Yeah, but the garbage truck and the dumpster stopped. And they were all standing behind Katrina.
Hello? Oh, good.
Excuse me.
Good evening. First of all, I want to welcome you all. I'm so glad to see so many students in the audience, and I'm glad to see the rest of you as well. My name is Betsy Mayberry, and I am the coordinator of the Southern Maine Initiative of the Camden Conference and on its advisory council. I want to thank our partners for this event, USM and the Portland Press Herald. I know we have people here from the Portland Press Herald, and I'm sure Matt will introduce them. The Camden Conference was actually started 33 years ago. The mission of the conference was to foster informed discourse on world issues. In addition to the conference itself, which happens in February, it sponsors dozens of related events in communities throughout Maine, in local libraries, and it also supports programs for hundreds of high school students and college students. In fact, 20% of the attendees at the Camden Conference are students from high schools and colleges. They have courses in their high schools, and they take a course at USM, a pop-up course, in the theme of the conference every year. The theme of this year's conference, which will occur on February 21st through 23rd, is The Media Revolution, Changing the World. The conference and related educational and community activities are made possible because of the support of hundreds of volunteers who give time and energy, and the support that members give us to support the activities that we do. Ticket sales cover less than 50% of our costs. So there are volunteer and membership applications in the lobby. I want to talk a little bit about the Camden Conference Southern Maine Initiative. Activities related to the conference began in the fall of 2014 with events in 3 Southern Maine libraries. We are currently providing community events from September through February in 9 libraries this year, from Auburn, Maine to York, Maine. We held 24 community events in 2019 and expect this to increase to 30 this year. All of our presenters at community events present free, and the attendance is also free. So we're doing a lot of education in the community. Tonight's press panel, titled Violence, Victims, and Healing, How the Media Handles Major Tragedies, is one of our special events. And we will once again present another special event, the Tom and Max Show, 100 years of history in 100 minutes on January 23rd at the Portland Public Library and in the Mid-Coast as well at 2 locations. The Camden Conference has been streamed live to Portland since 2016. The venues have all been at USM. We grow every year. We started with 65 in attendance in 2016, and last year we had 215 in attendance, and therefore decided to make the move from Luther Body Hall to Hannaford Hall in 2020 because of this growth. We clearly got to get out, though, this year and get more people in these seats we see. USM is a partner in this initiative, and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences teaches a pop-up course with 15 students. The Muskie School also participates, sending 10 students and a faculty member last year. The Camden Conference program, the Camden Conference program, Camden Conference in the Classroom, is a program for high school students. They sent 35 students last year to Portland and their faculty members, and we expect that this program will also grow. As you can see, we have a lot of interested students in our audience for this event. A course related to the Camden Conference theme has been taught at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, OLLI, since 2014, And we are currently discussing Ollie, which is a senior college, becoming partners as well at the Portland venue. Maine Public and the Portland Press-Herald have provided much-needed coverage, but we continue to explore ways of increasing our presence and our visibility in southern Maine and hope that you in the audience will help us with this task. Now I would like to turn the program over to Matt Storin, the president of the Camden Conference.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you all for coming under less than ideal weather conditions. We really appreciate it. I also want to add my thanks to USM, with whom we've had a long and nice relationship, and also add my thanks to the Portland Press-Herald, and we're delighted that the publisher of the Portland Press-Herald, the Maine Sunday Telegram, Lisa DeSisto, is here. Can you wave, Lisa? I confess that our chosen topic tonight is a grim one, but I think it projects a positive lesson at the same time. The mainstream press, both print and broadcast, is now under extreme duress and challenge. But this extraordinary panel, who will be introduced shortly, will reflect the vital role that news organizations play in their communities, not only reporting essential facts, sometimes at personal risk, but also becoming, in many cases, the vital center of a town or city that is going through trauma. And tonight reminds us that the news has many important functions beyond reporting on one man in the White House. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Speaking of the value to a community, our moderator tonight is Megan Doyle Gray, whose work for the Portland Press-Herald, to which she is deeply devoted, brings value to this region on a daily basis. Megan, who was raised in the South and Midwest and graduated from the University of Notre Dame, is all in on New England and Portland. She has been chosen in recent years as the outstanding young reporter in 2 states, first in New Hampshire, where she reported for the Concord Monitor, and more recently here in Maine. Megan, the podium is all yours.
Thank you to Matt for that very kind introduction, and thank you to our panelists for being here today, and to all of you. I can say personally that as a young journalist, it's really exciting to have the chance to learn from the group that we have assembled here this evening. I'll cut to the chase and introduce them. We have first Peter Ember, a former producer for ABC News. Peter directed news coverage of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the massacre at Columbine High School in Colorado in 1999. We also have Brian McRory here, the editor of the Boston Globe. The paper also won a Pulitzer Prize for its reporting at the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013. Julie Anderson is here, all the way from sunny Florida. She's the editor-in-chief of the Sun Sentinel Media Group and the Orlando Sentinel Media Group. Her staff at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland in 2018. And finally, we have David Shribman here, the retired editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. The newspaper was awarded a Pulitzer for its coverage of the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. So first, I'll turn it over to our panelists to tell you a little bit about, as I've hinted, their experience with our topic here this evening. They'll have a short presentation for all of you, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions. So pay attention, but start thinking of what you might want to ask while they're here.
So we have 10 minutes? Yes. Okay, I'll try to keep to it. First, I want to welcome all the students, and I want to give a shout out to Susan Carter, who's here, who I'm involved with the conference on the education side. And Susan is really the force that has made the Camden Conference and the classroom program so successful. And I just want to give her a round of applause. And then now I have to correct my introduction. I didn't direct any coverage of anything. I was a field producer for ABC News, which meant I got assignments. or I pitch my own ideas for stories. And I did this for a quarter of a century out of Los Angeles. So I'm going to talk about Columbine. On April 20th, 1999, 2 students at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, murdered 12 fellow students and 1 teacher, and then killed themselves. The word Columbine, like Katrina or Watergate or 9/11, is all that need be said for everyone here to know instantly what we're talking about. I worked for ABC News from 1983 until 2010, as I said, out of the Los Angeles Bureau. So I can add a couple of other names that you all know, Rodney King and O.J. Simpson, that became part of my professional life for extended periods of time. But on that day in 1999, I was on a plane to Denver as quickly as I could catch one. I remember checking into a hotel downtown and having dinner with the correspondent, Judy Muller, who flew with me. But after that, I don't remember where I slept or where I ate for almost 2 weeks. On the day after the massacre, Judy and I were assigned to put together a story for World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, profiling some of the victims. And can we please show that now?
Other nations'
We don't have
headlines.
any sound.
Not for the first time. America is seen as a country which cannot control violence committed with guns. In Japan today, the headline was, "How sick is the gun society?" Here in the U.S. West, where guns are not thought of in such a dismissive way, there is enormous concern about gun violence, of course, but today, here, this is about individual lives. Here's ABC's Judy Muller.
To the rest of the world, they are victims. But to their friends and families, they are much, much more. Rachel Scott, a junior who was active in drama and adored by her friends.
She's the kind of person that, like, if you even hurt, like, a fly or something in front of her, she would get so upset.
And Lauren Townsend, a popular junior. And John Tomlin, described by a neighbor as an all-American kid.
My son and husband had just helped him with a little project on his car the night before and had spoken with him. And in fact, they had run into Lauren at the restaurant the very night before, too. So this is just, it's way too close to home.
Dave Sanders, a school teacher for 22 years, a basketball coach. He leaves a wife and 4 children, 3 of them adopted.
If any students of his ever had any problems, he'd always take the extra time or extra effort to try to, to touch their lives and try to help them out with whatever he could.
And Isaiah Scholes, gunned down perhaps because he was black.
They shot him, I don't know how many times it was, but they shot him and then they go, "Is that black guy dead over there yet?"
Isaiah wanted to be a comedian.
Everything that he needed, he had it, He studied, everything that Isaiah needed, Isaiah had it. Yeah.
His father resisted the truth as long as he could.
Yesterday, really, I was in denial all day yesterday. I knew it yesterday that he wasn't going to come back.
To the rest of the world, victims. To those who knew them, much, much more.
Our hearts are still so sad for those who don't know, but they feel certain that they've lost their children.
By this evening, that certainty was no longer a feeling. All the families had been notified. Peter?
It is no surprise that
This year marks 20 years since Columbine, and preparing for this evening, I found a number of articles about the journalistic impact of this particular event. Columbine is considered by some to be the template for how tragic events are now covered by the media, especially television. At Columbine, I produced stories for World News Tonight that aired every day for over a week. As I reviewed them for tonight, I realized that they pretty much seem to support the template idea. I did a heroism story and a moving forward story, a story about crisis, grief, and victim counseling. They all seem to be part now of that recurring coverage blueprint. So it's little wonder that the word Columbine resonates in our minds. It was the first tragedy of its kind to get this nonstop, wall-to-wall coverage. I think you can probably create a list of your own stories you'd predict will be shown in the wake of a mass shooting or bombing. The talking heads, advocates for gun control, retired FBI profilers, the thoughts and prayers politicians, the Sunday church services. And the template or playbook is aided by rituals, things that now are done customarily at all these tragedies. I want to show the story I did on day 8, please.
Three of the students killed at Columbine in last week's violence: Lauren Townsend, Cassie Bernal, and Daniel Rohrbaugh. Dave Sanders was also buried today. He was the only teacher killed. Many of them think he's the hero. ABC's Judy Muller from Littleton tonight as well.
David Sanders was remembered today by his family,
Dave Sanders was my favorite grandfather.
by his fellow teachers,
He will never, ever be taken from us.
and by his students who were with him in the cafeteria when the
He was
shooting
running
began.
around, and I remember seeing him jump over the chairs and yelling everybody to get down. And I truly believe that he saved my life with many, many other people.
At the same time, he was being honored by strangers, all those people who have been flocking to the impromptu memorial site at a park next to the school.
And I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church that much, but it's almost, it's sacred ground. This will always be sacred ground.
It started at student Rachel Scott's car, which became a shrine after she was killed. It soon spread up the hill, across an embankment, and beyond. And it continues to grow, seated by people from as far away as Fort Wayne, Indiana, and as close as a Colorado boy who came with crosses he'd made from popsicle sticks.
I felt like it was a way to show my love for the people who got killed.
Does it help to come down and do this?
Yes, very much.
What strikes you most here is the quiet. Despite the fact that it's drawing a large crowd, despite the fact that this memorial is in the middle of a media encampment, there is always a hush. The younger visitors leave stuffed animals and poems written in the vernacular of adolescence. "I can't deal," says one, "it's so unfair." It all adds up to a moving but depressingly familiar tribute.
Are we getting used to having these memorials? Do we know what to bring for a memorial? Because it keeps happening. I'm sorry. That bothers me.
And in that, she is not alone. Judy Muller, ABC News, Littleton.
That last soundbite from the woman despairing over memorials becoming routine caused me to have two reactions, and I'll be honest. The first was that we had struck soundbite gold. The second was, she's right, and this is awful, that it has come to this. And that was 20 years ago. And I also let myself feel hurt, but only momentarily. I was originally going to also talk about Hurricane Katrina, which I covered from Baton Rouge, where the majority of the evacuees from New Orleans fled. But natural disasters as tragedy are different from shootings and bombings in an obvious but important way. Hurricanes and earthquakes are unavoidable. We don't ask why they happened. We may question how, as in the case of Katrina, governments respond or find some other tangential angle to report, but a shooting or a bombing leaves us disturbed and anxious in a very personal way. We all feel unsafe. We all want to know why. As I said, I covered Columbine on site for nearly 2 weeks. And for the first and only time in my career, ABC News had a psychologist come and talk to those of us who were still there toward the end. And it was more like a grievance session where we felt free to criticize our bosses in New York for wanting stories when we felt we had already done them all. I don't remember if it was before or after that my camera crew and I were accosted by a local person in a parking lot who told us in strong language that we had overstayed our welcome and needed to leave. I didn't argue with him. Broadcast a network news broadcast to an audience that is the nation. I believe ABC News did a good job of reporting at Columbine, but we probably stayed too long. Could you put up my slide, please? This observation was by a journalist, actually the father of Hottie Carter, who worked in the Carter White House. Yes, we, the networks, came, we covered, and we vanished. Let me ask you to think about this. How much coverage of the school shooting that killed 17 students in Parkland, Florida last year did you watch? And a few months before that, how much coverage of the mass shooting in Las Vegas that killed 58 people and wounded over 400 did you watch? I'm afraid we are getting used to these events like the woman at the memorial in Columbine observed. And that's also a tragedy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Megan. Thank you to Matt Storin, and thank you to the whole Camden Conference for having me up here. I will grab any excuse I can to come up to Maine and to this great city. I went to college 45 minutes up the road in Lewiston many years ago. I find any excuse I can to get to a little place I have down in Biddeford, and weekends throughout the year often find me sitting in duck fat eating the best French fries in the world, or going to Holy Donuts and doing things I shouldn't do in there, or Gelato Fiasco. Because I love Portland as much as I do, I would ask everybody in here a favor, and Matt was already kind enough to call out Lisa DeSisto, the publisher of the Portland Press-Herald. I'd like to go one step further. If you're in here tonight, you care about your community, you care about the news industry. We're facing incredibly challenging times. If you are not a subscriber to the Portland Press-Herald, I would go home tonight and take out a subscription. Every truly great city needs a truly great newspaper behind it in ways that you can't even imagine, and they need your support right now more than ever, so thank you for thinking of that. I will also announce that when I leave the Globe, I would very much like to be the food critic for the Portland Press-Herald. So I'm hoping that sets me up with the publisher perfectly well. The Boston Marathon bombings, this is a really grim panel, by the way. You're right about that, Matt. It's next year, maybe we can get the National Association of Funeral Home Directors to come and have their event here. But the Boston Marathon bombings occurred in my fourth month as editor of the Globe, and it was an event the likes of which we'll never see again in Boston, I hope and assume. And it's a little bit different than most other disasters, man-made or natural, in that it carried on for 5 days. There was no end to it at all. Most disasters usually have one event that goes on, and then great news organizations do their level best to make sense of it, probe why it happened, and move on. With the Boston Marathon bombings, it occurred over 5 days. It began on Monday, April 15th, 2013, a little before 2:50 in the afternoon at the Boston Marathon finish line. It was late in the day. Most other news organizations had moved on. The elite runners had crossed the line several hours earlier. The Globe was still there because we are committed to the community, and we still had photographers and reporters there to chronicle people who were still coming across the line, and many people were. 2 bombs exploded within a couple of blocks of each other, within about 15 seconds of each other, and it was complete and total chaos. A Globe videographer, Boston.com videographer, actually Steve Silva, walked toward the explosions down Boylston Street, which is one of the grand thoroughfares of Boston. He was in danger. There was no question. He didn't know if there would be other explosions, but he put his video camera in front of him and walked toward the explosions, announcing what he was seeing along the way. Globe photographers ran toward the explosions, John Tumlaki and David Ryan specifically, capturing hundreds of images. It would be the iconic images of the explosion, going, for the rest of time. That night, reporters, that afternoon really, reporters streamed out of the Globe newsroom, heading for downtown Boston to Back Bay to the site of the tragedy. That night, we were in hospitals all over the city trying to get a sense of what happened and the impact that it had caused. We knew probably most clearly the extent of what was going on, not only through the photographs that we were seeing beamed back to the newsroom, but when Patty Wen, who is a terrific Globe reporter, came across a mother in the waiting room of Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital that night, and she shared her story with Patty that both her sons were at the marathon, and both her sons were devastated by the explosion. They both lost limbs, and she was there waiting out one of them. There was another, I believe, a different hospital. She was trying to figure out where to be, when to be. And that really put in high relief the extent of the damage. Reporters worked through the night, editors worked through the night, and then Tuesday came. Tuesday, there were no answers yet. There was more of an understanding of the extent of the damage. 3 people dead, including a very young victim, Martin Richard. 2 other victims, Lindsay Liu, who was a student at Boston University from China, Crystal Campbell, who was a young local woman, very active locally. The 3 of them died in the 2 explosions. The suspects were still at large, and there was no clue at that point who they were. So the Globe was obviously doing everything it could to figure out the extent of the damage and who did it. And it was a very, very tense day in Boston. Day 3, rumors abounded. Federal agents had set up a massive operation on the Boston waterfront where they were trying to piece together the 2 scenes on Boylston Street with all of the fragments and everything else that was going on. Back Bay, the city's one of the city's busiest neighborhoods, was essentially shut down as authorities at the federal, state, and local level were investigating and trying to piece things together. Every video camera in that neighborhood had been grabbed. There were pleas to the public for help if anybody was shooting iPhone photos. And rumors were everywhere about who had done it. There were reports of possible suspects that turned out not to be true. And the city was really, really tense, understandably, because people who did this had not been captured, and anyone who did this would be capable of doing virtually everything. Day 4, a lot of things came to a head. The Globe got a tip early in the morning, before 7 o'clock, that authorities had 2 pictures of 2 different suspects. And at that point, authorities told us that they planned to release those photos later in the day to get a sense from the public of who these people were. President Obama was flying into Boston for a memorial service at one of the city's iconic churches. He arrived. He said in a very emotional ceremony, "Boston will run again." And then late in the day, after the Globe had reported that authorities would do this, federal authorities working with city police, state police, did in fact release images of 2 suspects who they had on video and still photography, having just dropped knapsacks at the places that exploded on the, near the finish line. That night at 11 o'clock, there was reports coming over the police wire, the police radios, that an MIT police officer, Sean Collier, had been shot and at close range. And I mean, anybody looking back had a sense of dread when that happened for beyond the typical reasons of a police officer being shot in the line of duty. It's easy to look back and say it felt like there was a connection to something at that time. Immediately after, a young man, a local student, was hijacked in his car in Cambridge and taken on a wild ride by the two marathon bombers who would quickly become identified as Tamerlan and Shahar Sarnaev. He, at a local gas station, when they stopped to fill up his car, he ran for his life and escaped. And minutes later, after midnight, there was a wild shootout as police pursued this car in a neighborhood or a nearby community in Boston, Watertown. There were explosives thrown, dozens and dozens, actually hundreds of rounds of gunfire were exchanged. In the end, Shahar Sarnaev escaped. He ran over his own brother, Tamerlan, in the street, essentially killing him. But he got away. He fled. This was all going on at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. For the first time, and I suspect the only time in my career as an editor, at 1 o'clock I called the publisher up and asked if we could hold the presses, which we did. On our website, between 2 and 3 in the morning, we had more than 400,000 people on the site at the same time, concurrently. We woke up Friday morning, and there was a suspect on the loose who we knew was about as dangerous as could be. At the same time, we had probably 20, probably more reporters, photographers, videographers out at the scene the night before. In Watertown. They had gotten there on foot, on bicycle, on car. Everyone was working through the night. Friday, we woke up, and the state, the governor ordered that everybody shelter in place in the Boston region. The MBTA, which is our mass transit system, stopped running. The Red Sox and Bruins both canceled games that night. Work was essentially called off across the region. The streets were eerily empty. And over 1,000 law enforcement agents combed through Watertown, through that section of Watertown, looking for the suspect. At about 6 o'clock that night, they hadn't found him yet, and they essentially told people in the region it's okay to go outside at this point. We're not, to this day, sure why they thought it was okay to go outside at that point, but one man, Mr. Henneberry, who lived in Watertown, did go outside of his house. He noticed the flap that covered the boat in his backyard was waving in the wind, and he thought that was odd, so we went over and took a closer look and saw that there was blood on the ropes or the ties that were supposed to lock the flap down. He called police. Within moments, his yard was flooded again with law enforcement agents and Boston police officers. And they successfully got Shahar Sarnaev out of the boat and arrested him. I think it was a little after 7 o'clock that night, so it finally came to an end. So we had a very tired Globe staff at that point. We had very tired first responders all over Boston. We had a very tired region. But to Matt's point about how a news organization can contribute to the health and well-being of a community in a time of crisis. And I really, really admire what my two colleagues, my two counterparts over here did with their organizations, and I'm excited about hearing it from them. What we did early on was we decided a few things. On the very first night, when it was complete bedlam in Boston, we made the decision that we're going to show photography in all its gory reality. We're not going to sanitize the events. We wanted the region and the world to see what had been done to our city. And that meant doing things that we don't typically do because we had access to this crime scene that reporters and photographers don't typically get. So we had images of people who had lost limbs. We had images of blood draining down sidewalks. We had images of people in a very, very high emotional state. We made individual decisions trying not to violate people's privacy, but we thought it was important to show the world what had happened there so that we could fully understand, the extent of the damage that had been done in so many ways to our community. Second, we made the decision that we really wanted to be first with everything and with almost everything we were. We also wanted to be right. We wanted to be the place where you could get reputable, reliable news in real time. Our website set records. It was so crowded the first and second days that it had actually collapsed, and we had to basically piece it back together with help from, obviously, our IT department. We were not perfect, but we were, for my money, very, very good. Third, we made a decision then that the media from around the world were in Boston at that time. It was a big event. It was the biggest terrorist attack on our soil since 9/11. And so everybody was there. But we made the decision that we were going to tell the story from a Boston angle. And to do that properly, you had to tell the victim stories, and that we were going to be with those victims not just for that day or week. We were going to hang with them for a long time to come. We knew then intuitively that the recoveries would be very uneven, that we were not about to witness a Disney movie come to life about Boston Strong, that there was true emotional damage, there was true physical damage, and we were going to chronicle that and hew to reality as best we possibly could. And the victims, so many of them, invited the Globe into their houses, into their lives, into their hospitals. So many Globe journalists became lifelong friends with the victims they covered. And we continued to tell their stories for months and even years afterward to make sure the community knew the extent of the damage and how people were recovering. I think that covers everything I had to say here, but I'm very, very eager to hear these guys next.
Brian, I relived that. My son was at Boston College when that happened, and I was glued to the computer watching everything you were doing. And the Boston Globe did such a remarkable job when they covered that online, because they gave their online presentation was so fast and accurate, and it was something to behold, really. I think it taught a lot of us how to cover something online.
Thank you, Julie.
So on Valentine's Day 2018 at 2:29 p.m., our breaking news editor, Doug Phillips, was half listening to the police scanner, and he heard a voice say, "I need bolt cutters. There's a kid stuck in the fence." And he started listening a little bit longer, and then it got a little bit more grim, and he said, "Students are down." Our police reporter quickly confirmed that the incident he was talking about was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, which was about 10 miles west of our newsroom, the Sun Sentinel. She got out of there, she took reporters and photographers with her, and got there. Within 19 minutes of hearing that on the radio, we posted our first story online, while the police were still going through the building looking for the mass shooter. Within hours, the Sun Sentinel had updated that main story hundreds of times and was able to piece together a profile of the troubled shooter and the shooter, which had basically killed 17 staff and students. Relying on public records and deep community sources, we were able to detail more detail about the shooter. We were able to tell the story about the police lapses. We were able to look at the student activism that arose out of that, and also able to talk about the community resources to help people heal. I got to the Sun Sentinel 2 weeks after that event and became editor-in-chief right in the middle of it. I came from the Orlando Sentinel, and we had covered Pulse. So the first thing I asked my managing editor when I got there was, how are the journalists doing? Because I knew, after covering Pulse, that it takes a toll when you cover trauma like that. And so, when we're covering something like that, adrenaline will get you through a few weeks. But you think about, journalists are listening to 911 calls, they're talking to the victims' families, they're talking to the survivors, and they're surrounded by so much sadness that you really have to watch what it's doing to your journalists. But Parkland was different from Pulse in several ways, and the biggest being that student activism arose almost immediately out of that disaster. The students, social media savvy, and their ability to articulate a call to action was the story for the next several weeks, and it became a national story. Our approach while covering March for Our Lives was twofold. One, we wanted to make sure that we were documenting the victims' stories individually before too much time had passed. So we did that in a way that we did individual video vignettes of the activists, the students, the teachers, the police, the rabbis, everybody who was a stakeholder in this. And then we also stepped back and we asked ourselves, how did this happen? What happened? Because frankly, we didn't have a lot of information. The day that that happened, the school district and the police all shut down public records, illegally, I might add. But they basically held tight the information. So we wanted to know what really happened. Interestingly, before we could even find out what happened, we got a visit from business leaders. And they told us, we don't want you to find out what happened. The community needs to heal. We want you to move on. And I might add, there were a few large advertisers in that group as well. But we decided that we had to know, we had to understand what had happened. So we did, and believe it or not, this is what we found out. We found out that the school that was supposed to be one of the safest in Florida actually had many crimes that went unreported on that campus, including a lot of trespassing. We found out that the troubled shooter had requested to move from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas to the school, the special school that he had been at, where he'd got a lot more behavioral and emotional support, and that the school had bungled that request. We found out that the shooter actually had committed some crimes on campus and had gone unpunished for them. We found out that the FBI had bungled 2 very specific tips about the shooter and had failed to pass those on to the FBI South Florida office. We also found out that 7 deputies failed to go into the freshman building while the massacre was happening. They waited outside, contrary to their training. We also found out that 3 school monitors failed to call a code red, even though they had radios, and they could have prevented deaths. These were just a few of the things that we found out, that if we had stopped digging when the community leaders had asked us to, we would not have known any of that. Fortunately, the community and the parents, especially the parents, encouraged us to keep digging. And they actually turned to activism themselves because they wanted to try to make something positive out of such a horrible tragedy. And we felt the same way. We wanted to make sure that change happened. And change did happen. Within weeks of the massacre, Florida, which is known as the gunshine state, had enacted legislation that heretofore that would never have happened. The purchase age for guns went up from 18 to 21. They enacted red flag laws. They required an armed guard on every campus in Florida, and they toughened the requirements to report crimes on campus. The FBI apologized for bungling the tips, and they say they revamped the way that they handle them. The governor of Florida removed the Broward sheriff for the way that his department handled the incident. He's going to be in the Senate, he'll be on a Senate trial in 2 weeks. He's trying to get his job back. But the 7 deputies who failed to go in, they either retired or lost their jobs. Our newsroom changed as well. And part of that was a result of the Parkland activists themselves. Basically, we had to reevaluate how we were covering the shooter. We were, in the beginning stages of the tragedy, we used the image of the shooter and his name in headlines quite a lot. And we were basically, I think, chastened by the activists that maybe we were giving him too much notoriety, the notoriety that he craved. And so we reevaluated, and we just used the images and in his name when it was absolutely necessary. Internally, we did many things to try to protect our journalists, to try to make sure that they were getting through this as best they could. So one of the things we did is we invited in therapy dogs many times into the newsroom. And you would be surprised what kind of effect that has on journalists. We made sure that they had access to free mental health counseling. We made sure they took their days off. And we just watched their emotional state. The length of time it took to uncover all this was 10 months, basically February to December. So this really did kind of take a toll. We wrapped it up, though, in the most impactful piece of journalism. We called it Unprepared and Overwhelmed, and it was a multimedia piece that basically described the 30 minutes of the shooting and the before and the after, and it just told it in an interactive way. The many awards that we received, including the Pulitzer Prize, was a vindication for us that we were on the right path, that we were right in trying to figure out everything that happened. Now, I'd be lying if I said that it brought the community together. It did not. The community was grateful. The parents were grateful. The institutions that we covered, the school district, and the sheriff's office, were resentful and defensive, and we still kind of have a strained relationship. But the story keeps going. You know, we had interviewed the survivors from Columbine and Sandy Hook, and they told us that a tragedy like this will reverberate in your community for decades. And so we're with this story for the long term. We keep in touch with the activists, with the parents, especially the parents and the students, and we're just going to be checking in on them because this was the worst disaster, the worst story in Broward County history. So it's part of us. We have to stay with it. And unfortunately, we are, I think, better prepared for the next time it happens.
Well, I'm the cleanup hitter of a grim evening. I was the editor of the Post-Gazette in Pittsburgh when 11 people were killed at the Tree of Life at worship at the Tree of Life Synagogue, 3 blocks from my house. This was a neighborhood tragedy, a tragedy of a faith community, a tragedy for the entire enclave of Squirrel Hill, which is a part of Pittsburgh, and for Pittsburgh itself. I had never witnessed anything quite like it, and listening to my colleagues here, Julie and Brian, I can't help but say that, can you imagine what their communities would be like without their newspapers? They'd be less rich, of course. You wouldn't get the cartoons and the Patriot scores, I guess. Well, you get the Patriot scores elsewhere. I'm waiting for them to lose sometime. But you would not really have known, you wouldn't have known what happened in these tragedies, and you wouldn't have had, despite what Julie concluded with, you wouldn't have had a unifying base of information that a community craves and needs so badly. So I salute my colleagues. I've known Brian for 25 years. I've known Julie for 25 minutes. But I salute them both. It's a very sobering work that they did, and what they did was an example for us when it was our turn. My own story is that I was doing exactly what I was doing on the morning of 9/11. I was AWOL. I was at the gym. Ours was a Saturday morning, so I guess I can be forgiven. On the exercise bike, when a friend of mine called and said, I just drove by Tree of Life and I saw a police officer walking backwards shooting into the building. Well, I'm enough of a newsman to know that that doesn't happen every day. And so, as I did with 9/11, I left without showering, got in the car, and for some inexplicable reason, I drove home to Squirrel Hill to see what was going on. And things were still developing. I was cut off by police cars and all this sort of stuff. I realized what was happening. I made some phone calls, got people moving, did something that was inexplicable. I had started the laundry. I changed the bed, started the laundry before I left for the gym. And so I went home and took the laundry out of the washer and put it in the dryer. I reflected later that I thought that I needed some kind of cleansing and that I needed clean sheets that night. Then I went back to the office, and of course, people were streaming in. And the news took a long while, as it does at all these things, a long while for us to understand what had happened. But it was very clear that some of the people who were doing the reporting on this story themselves were suffering great loss. Our city editor, Lillian Thomas's GP, her physician, was killed that morning. One of our reporters' mother had lunch with two of the victims every day for the last several years. One of our young reporters, who lived not far from me, and thus not far from Tree of Life, was deeply affected even as he reported all this, and I ended up calling him in a day or two later and giving him counsel and urging him to seek counsel on his own. This was a moment in our community that was a tragedy, obviously. It was the largest anti-Semitic act in American history. It jarred our community, but it's a special enclave of Pittsburgh where this occurred, Squirrel Hill. There are 11 synagogues within a mile of my home. The important crossroads, Forbes and Murray Avenues, are marked by a bell tower where the clock has the letters in Hebrew. It's not at all remarkable on Friday nights to see scores, dozens, scores, hundreds of Orthodox Jews walking to temple in their distinctive outfits and with their distinctive bearing. At Christmas time, which for this community is really more like Hanukkah time, people drive through the snowy streets with huge menorahs on their cars. It looks ridiculous, but it's part of the tradition there. It is a community that is thoroughly without prejudice. I'm Jewish. My wife is a Polish Catholic. We go with a rabbi every Christmas Eve to midnight mass, the three of us. Only one is really qualified to go, but the other two of us go along. And at the end of midnight mass, as in his recessional, the bishop always stops and gives Rabbi Bisnow and me and my wife a hug and inquires after our daughter, who is 7 or 8 months from ordination as a rabbi herself. So this is a community that is steeped in tolerance and steeped in religion, and where Catholics and Jews live cheek by jowl, and in our house, they sleep in the same bed. And they both snore, by the way. So we each claim. And so this got to the heart of our identity. And so the reporting we did was to explore that identity and to explore what happened, much as Julie said, but also to explore the community. You know, I'm kind of trained up more as a historian than as a journalist, and I remember a episode in the House of Commons in 1939, right after the Nazis crossed the Belgian line and invaded Belgium on their way to France. And there was this debate in Britain about what to do in the Parliament, and someone stood up and said, "Speak for England." And so I would give a homily every day to our mob of reporters, and I told that story, and I said that our job was not necessarily only to speak to Pittsburgh, but it was to speak for Pittsburgh nationally. And so we explored a little bit about the nature of our community, learned a lot. We're pretty pleased with what we learned, even amid the tragedy. But we were all deeply hurt. Julie and Brian will tell you that in the fraternity or sorority of news reporters and newspapers, we send each other food, meals during, we sent meals to you, and you sent meals to us. Brian was still waiting for yours. But reporters like nothing more than a free meal. And so we worked around the clock as Julie's reporters did and as Brian's did, with a sense of mission unlike any I've seen. I've covered a lot of stuff. My early experience was covering the Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, and I covered a bunch of other stuff. But I've never covered a story that affected me so deeply and so personally, in part because of my own faith and in part because our home is, as I said, 3 blocks from where this occurred. I drive by that synagogue almost every day. When we walk downtown to go out for breakfast, we walk right by there. We still drive by there, with some trepidation, of course. And so this was a personal event for all of us, and we treated it as something that happened to our family. We later, having watched what was going on at Julie's paper, we later had several forums on anti-Semitism. We had Rabbi Myers, who was the rabbi there at the time, speak with us and to us, and in forums much like this. We had a lot of outreach to the community, and I'm very proud of the work we did. It was the best work I've ever seen our staff do, and I was very, very proud. It was, for me, a valedictory moment, because I left the paper several months later. Brian and Julie will tell you that being a newspaper editor today it's really a horrible job. You're fighting with everybody, with the community, with people whose papers are wet, or didn't reach the porch. Sometimes you fight with we didn't fight too much with the business side, but you worry about the profitability of the paper. You worry about whether you have to lay people off. You worry about the fact that I would bet a third of you don't even get the paper here, sad to say, but you will after Brian's appeal and go home and subscribe. And it's a horrible job. It's really a tough job. And I often wondered why I went to Pittsburgh and why I had that job. And I said to somebody during this week that now I know why I was there. I'm very proud of what we did. I'm humbled by it. I did a lot of writing myself, speaking for Pittsburgh. And we all tried to speak for Pittsburgh. It's a remarkable community that was rendered even more remarkable by this event. It changed us all. I think those events changed the two of you, didn't they? And it certainly fired our sense of purpose and our pride in our work and our determination in an era of fake news and all of this kind of hooey, that what we do is not only noble but ennobling, that it's the most important work we can do, that it's what we were put on this earth to do, and that we won't be discouraged by bad revenue and by people telling us that we're liars, and by people saying that we're corrupt and enemies of the people. I will say one thing, because inevitably one of you will ask about fake news. I'll say this. I'm now in my 50th year being a journalist. I did start young, but I am in my 50th year. And in 50 years of journalism, not once did I create or was I witness to someone else creating a story that was known to be false. Not once in 50 years did I see any fake news. And I bet we could add your many years or not so many years to that we are the last believers. We believe in the Constitution. We believe in the First Amendment. And I learned in this era, I was reminded in this era that the First Amendment isn't only a freedom of the press, and the First Amendment also affects religion. And so I would leave you with this thought. When it comes to religion and the press, we share the same amendment. Thanks.
So I heard all four of you at some point touch on the personal trauma and pain that comes with covering a tragedy. So just want to say thank you to you for sharing that with us tonight. Now we'll open it up to questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, there are microphones in the aisles, and you can just walk up and introduce yourself and ask your question. So feel free to line up if there's someone standing there in front of you as well. Maybe while you're all thinking of your questions, I know there's some journalism students out there, so I'm talking to you too. I'll start with one for our 4 panelists. All 4 of you also referred in some manner to some of the chaos of trying to learn about what happened at the time of these terrible events, sort of the chaos that comes with this breaking news alert. Can you talk a little bit about how you guard against misinformation and make sure that the news you're putting out to your readers is the most accurate information that you have?
Well, I think that fortunately we had reporters who had deep sources, deep community ties and sources within the police community. And so we reached out to them because officially they were not giving us a lot of information, but we got information anyway, you know, kind of on the sly from people that we trusted high up in the police department. So that was one way. In the early minutes, several news TV stations actually misidentified the shooter. Yeah, we held back, thank God, and just to make sure we could confirm it and realize that they had gone with the wrong person, and that speaks to the you really have to make sure, especially when you're identifying a killer, that you really have your facts straight. And everybody tries to rush, but in that case, you don't rush. You have to make sure it's right.
You all think that we're big liberals, we newspaper editors, but we're the most conservative people on earth. We really care about the old-fashioned values, and we really care, as Brian said earlier, that we would rather be right than first. And so I think that prevailed for all 3 of these newsrooms. And we didn't have to tell people in our newsroom, make sure you have it right. It wasn't the only day in which we had to get things right. We had to get the Steelers score right. We have to get the comments of the president right. We have to get all of these things right. This is not something that that we had to worry about on that day. I did not have one moment of doubt that what we were putting on the web and in the newspaper was true. I didn't have one moment of doubt about it. Did you, Brian?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question. And these events, as you well know, cause a fury. And on social media, in other news organizations, there are supposed facts that get thrown around, sometimes recklessly. Things feed on themselves. Reporters and editors are driving on adrenaline in a situation like this. In the case of the bombings, as I said earlier, we got almost everything right, and we got almost everything first. We still had a situation which I very much regret, and it was on the 3rd day. Major news organizations around the country, including CNN, had been reporting that there was a suspect in custody, and we had not reported that because we couldn't confirm it. And in the end, we did have a reporter with what to that point had been an impeccable law enforcement source say that it was correct, and we put it online after much hemming and hawing when we got it confirmed a second way. Within about an hour, I realized it was wrong, and we quickly pulled it down and typed up a very full correction for what we did. And I think about that all the time because I worked with David many, many years ago. I mean, we do not take mistakes lightly. We do not throw information around recklessly, but in that particular situation, it wasn't that other places were reporting it. It was at that point the quality of our sourcing just seemed to be the gold standard, and somehow that got misled. And so we owed it to our readership, to the community, to just face up to it immediately. pull it down, write a correction, be very upfront with it, and make it prominent. We're human, and I don't think I'll ever let that happen again.
I'm sort of the outlier here with television. Believe me, I took very seriously the mission to be right. It didn't matter if I was first, I wanted to be right. That hasn't always been the case now with news reporting, but I tried my best. In getting prepared for this evening, I found an article that came out in a magazine called 5280, which is actually the elevation of Denver, about the mistakes that were made at Columbine, and there were a bunch. There's sort of the fog of war at the beginning of one of these stories when you're out covering it. The question that you need to ask anybody who's giving you information on the scene is simply this: how do you know that? And if you don't get a reasonable explanation, you can't report it. Pretty much what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and you can't even always trust people who are at the scene. You know, the number of people who, years too later, swore that they were at a Chicago Cubs game during Pearl Harbor is unbelievable. And for those of you who are too young to know, Pearl Harbor occurred in December. And even in a good Cubs year, they're not playing in December.
So it looks like we have a question from the audience. Go ahead.
We do have a question. The public always wants to know so much about the perpetrator of these awful crimes. And I notice there's such a tension between giving us information about the perpetrator and not glorifying the perpetrator. And I've noticed a tendency among news organizations not even to mention their name anymore. So I wonder where all of you come down in terms of identifying the perpetrator and what you think the public has a right to know about the perpetrator without trying to create copycats to commit the same crime.
Yeah, well, I think they do have the right to know the perpetrator, and yeah, in our case, our perpetrator lived. He's going to trial in January, so this is going to be tricky for us. But you know, you have to identify him or her. The trick is, or I guess what we decided to do was not constantly show his picture. Like every time, it was common practice, like every time you had a story, you'd have a picture. It might be just the mugshot, or it might be bigger. It's not really necessary all the time. When it really hit home for me was 2 months after it happened. Nicholas Cruz, the shooter, was getting bags and bags and bags of fan mail to the jail of young women who thought he was cute, and he had become a celebrity on social media. I thought, and he was loving it. Okay, so he was kind of a misfit. Never, you know, was always bullied and all that. And all of a sudden now he's famous, and you know, and that's when it really hit home to me. Is, you know, we're giving him the notoriety he craved, and maybe we shouldn't do that. So we have scaled it way back, but we still run his name.
From the same article I referred to a moment ago, there's a mention that since Columbine, there have been more than 40 perpetrators who have directly cited Columbine as influencing their acts. And collectively, those acts have killed over 200 people and injured over 400. You know, I just thought this was odd that presidential assassins, I don't know if Lee Harvey Oswald went by Lee Harvey Oswald, or if John Wilkes Booth went by John Wilkes Booth, or if Sarah Jane Olson went by Sarah Jane Olson, but they get these three names. I think it's a good thing not to do any more glamorization of a perpetrator than is necessary. In fact, I find it kind of interesting. The massacre that occurred, I believe, at the end of 2017 in Las Vegas. We still don't know the motivation for that guy, and I doubt that anybody here even knows his name, and that was the greatest mass massacre in U.S. history.
You know, I would add that I think we need to keep a sober reminder that violent crime in the United States is way down, and that even though that these are spectacular, I don't mean great by spectacular, but spectacular events, that violent crime is down. But sadly, these mass events are proliferating. I mean, a lot of us know that Charles Whitman was the guy at the Texas Tower in 1966 or something, and we remember a couple of names, but if my life depended on it, I couldn't tell you the name of the perpetrator of yours or the two brothers, I guess, there. And I think that the craving for notoriety, I think, is becoming moot because there are so many of these events. I don't remember any of these people's names. And it's not because I'm 65, it's because I don't remember their names.
It's a fine line between glamorizing what they've done and being very real about what they've done. And we have not shied away from using their names. I don't think that's appropriate. As a matter of fact, one of the longest stories we've had in my time in this role there was a story looking at the family of the two Tsarnaevs. The headline was The Fall of the House of Tsarnaev, looking at their journey to America and what caused or may have caused these kids to go as awful as they went. And it's one of the most read stories we've ever published. I think it was an important piece of work. I thought the Boston region, if not the country, was curious about what went wrong here. You have to accept going in. People are always asking, why did they do it? Why did they do it in any crime like this? You have to accept going in that the reasons may never be logical. They may never be comprehensible. But I think it's still important to plumb that to the best we can as journalists and not completely ignore it.
Take a question over here.
This has obviously been a very difficult few years for newspapers, particularly the printed version of newspapers. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the unique advantages newspapers have, particularly the printed versions, what they can provide that other news sources don't, and whether you think they will survive.
Well, if you look at tragedies like this, and I'm not sure if that's what you mean, the advantage we have is regional metropolitan newspapers is we know the community better than anybody else. We know the region better than anybody else. We know the officials. We have sources going in. We know the psyche. We know who our people are because we are those people. We live in the community. In terms of the print paper, I mean, I think we're all, Julie said it at the top of her discussion, we realize in these tragedies the impact of digital journalism because there's an immediacy to it that, quite frankly, is more effective than print. It's in your pocket. It's on your screen at work. It's with you all the time, and we can reach people literally seconds, minutes after a tragedy happens, and that's a pretty heady thing to be able to do. That said, print for us is a chance to be able to step back and to take a hard look at what really happened here. These guys did it. I mean, one of the most memorable headlines in recent history in newspapers is the headline that David Shribman put out in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in Yiddish. It was it turns defiant and community building all at once, and it spoke volumes. And you can't do that nearly as effectively in digital. And print is a place where the community, or a good part of the community, still goes in the morning to gather to read the paper, and that still has a very, very important role. But that's in no way to diminish the impact of digital at the same time.
I think we all agree, yeah.
I wondered, I'll take your question in just a second, but from a television perspective, is there something, Peter, that you feel that you can do differently than newspapers, or that you're...
I retired 10 years ago. Well, yeah, one thing definitely that I would like to see change is whenever there's a big event, tragedy like this, it becomes, you know, like Columbine was called high school or terror at the high school or something. It's given a title. It's branded. You see this all the time with news stories. You know, it's provocative. It's sensationalizing. I'd like to see that end. But I never rose to a position where I had any authority to change that.
Take your question over there.
My question is for Mr. Shribman. I thought it was very moving that you chose to have the opening lines of the Kaddish in Hebrew immediately after yes, as we all saw. And how did you come to that decision?
Well, this was probably Dave. Should probably put that up if there's somebody back there who could do that. Here we go. This was what, day 5 or so. And I had written on, I mean, I was the editor of the newspaper for 16 years, but I wrote about 3 headlines. We don't ordinarily write headlines. But I thought the night before, first of all, that this headline appeared on Friday morning, which would be day 6. And Friday at sundown is the Jewish Sabbath. And that's when the mourner's prayer, or the mourner's Kaddish, is said. And about on Wednesday night, I started, I don't know, in the middle of the night I thought of this. You do wonder whether, how those things happen. I went to I met a bunch of rabbis who had come into town for all these funerals, and I explored the idea with them. And so for Thursday night, which meant Friday's paper, I didn't tell anybody except the design editor and the managing editor, and I got a rabbi to give me that. It's 4 words. It's Hebrew, rendered in Hebrew, but the words are actually Aramaic. And it occurred to me that when words fail you, then maybe you're thinking in the wrong language. So I came up with the idea of doing this. We don't have that typeface in our composing, in our word processing system, but our design editor found out a way to do this. I will say that, speaking of mistakes, Brian, that last, on the left, far left, that last letter, I think is a hey, which is a silent letter. And the rabbi who gave me that with the hey at the end. But actually, the real prayer has a different silent letter there. So I had to write a correction and explain that I rendered that in Hebrew when it was supposed to be rendered in Aramaic, and there was one letter that was wrong. Nobody canceled their subscription out of rage out of that. I was astonished, really. Everybody told me not to do this, but I was astonished at the reaction. It was international reaction to this. But I did it for, not to impress my Hebrew school teachers from 50 years earlier. None of them would have been surprised I spelled it wrong. But as a gesture of community involvement, and to say that the voice of the community, those who speak to Pittsburgh and for Pittsburgh, were themselves, even regardless of faith, were saying the mourner's prayer on that day. And so it got a lot of play. We didn't sell any papers in Israel, but we got a lot of play there. And we got a lot of attention for this, and it is the thing I'm most proud of. And I don't know why I did it, but I'm glad I did.
Thanks for waiting with your question.
My question's actually for Brian mostly. You mentioned that you printed the photos with the graphic details about the bombing. I was wondering, was that correlated by the other newspapers in the area, and did that decision, you think, have an important effect on how people interpreted the tragedy?
We didn't correlate it with anybody else. We just made the decision on our own. It's hard to quantify the effect that something like that would have, except for, there was a realization immediately throughout Boston that, this was a god-awful mess, that it was, when you leave two bombs at ankle level on a crowded sidewalk, the carnage is going to be unimaginable. And so we wanted people to see that, and I think that people got that message pretty clearly when they saw the photography that we used and that other places picked up from us as well. So I think it had the intended effect. I can't sit here and say that, you know, X happened because of Y, but I think it was the right thing to do. Thank you.
I think this will be our last question over here.
So Brian, you mentioned during day 3 of the coverage, you put up a report that was retracted and a correction was issued. But despite that, the Globe still earned a Pulitzer for its coverage. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was Kevin Cullen's role during those 5 days in April, and should we consider his later transgressions, or do you consider his later transgressions separate from the award-winning efforts of those 5 days in April?
I don't think that Kevin's transgressions had any impact on the journalism that we produced in the Globe. His transgressions were in radio interviews, mostly in Europe, and then many months later at a conference, I think in Washington or somewhere else. He didn't have anything in the Globe that was not accurate or true.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have time for one more, you think? Go ahead.
Thank you. It's a sad occasion, but an interesting coincidence that you happen to be here this week when the Biddeford Journal, used to be called the Biddeford Soccer Journal, I think, a newspaper that had been in existence for over 100 years, is closing down. I think it's this week that they're printing their last edition. Biddeford is a city about maybe 20 miles south of here that covers mainly York County, but also national and international news. And I'm wondering if there's any feeling among the media at large that there's an obligation when a local newspaper shuts down to provide coverage for that region, to do the investigative journalism that that newspaper may have done when it was healthy. And I wonder, say in regard to the Post-Gazette, would there be any obligation or any feeling of obligation if a newspaper in State College were to close down? Would the Post-Gazette say, well, we've got to provide coverage over there? Or if a newspaper in Gloucester or Fitchburg were to close down, would there be a feeling of obligation by the Globe that we've got to provide those people with some kind of coverage because we feel we have an obligation? Thank you.
I'll start by saying that I was on a paper that went out of business, the Washington Star, in August of 1981, and there's no greater sadness than you could have than being on a paper or witnessing a paper going out of business. And it was, as I know it is for Julie and especially for Brian, who I know much better, that at some point while you're the editor, your determination is to save the jobs of your colleagues as much as anything else. If a paper went out of business in State College, and it's quite a good newspaper in State College, we probably would do some of it because we had, in my time, we had a correspondent in State College. There is a college sports team that performs from time to time there. And so we have somebody on the ground, so you actually gave me a softball on that one. You should have asked me what we would do in Uniontown, or what we should have done maybe in McKeesport, where the McKeesport Daily News went out of business. I would say more broadly that a lot of people tell us what our obligations are who don't read our paper or pay for it. I've sat in on many sessions of people, particularly from the arts community, who are fervent in their in their belief that we owe them coverage. The last time they met, I got a list of all of them, and none of them subscribed to the Post-Gazette, but they certainly named Phil Gailey, who's a very good friend of mine. And we were actually reporting partners. And Phil wrote a piece about the death of the Star, and he said the death of the Star reminded him of people who sat in airport departure lounges mourning the fact that the trains were going out of business. So a lot of you are sitting here in the equivalent, the functional equivalent, I don't mean to blame any of you, but many people are sitting in the functional equivalent of an airport departure lounge, worrying about trains, people worrying about the death of local newspapers who don't subscribe to them. So if anything, one of our messages here is that we have witnessed a lot of death, but we certainly don't want to witness the death of a craft we have devoted our lives to, and which is devoted to your lives as well.
But I'd say we would look at it as an opportunity. I mean, if we could go into an adjacent region, and if there was enough population to support, support it business-wise, either advertising or circulation-wise, I think we would take that opportunity.
And it is an awful thing when a paper like the Biddeford paper closes. We actually have a reporter who is in Biddeford this week chronicling the closing of this paper. It was a very cherished institution there that had a very long, successful history. Our main obligation is to our core readership, and we have to make sure that we can't spread ourselves too thin by trying to cover too much, because we're all facing the same sorts of challenges in an industry that where advertising, specifically print advertising, is declining at 20% a year, and more readers prefer to read us online than in print, and online just plain makes less money than print does. So we're all trying to balance, trying to achieve sustainability, and what we can't do is take our eye off our core readership in pursuit of covering other things. But as Julie said, when there is opportunity out there, and good business intersects with civic involvement, we jump at it. But that's not always the case.
Putting in a final plug for the Camden Conference, there is a media revolution going on. And one of the things that has happened is there's no appointment anything anymore. Not newspapers, not television. You want access to what you want to know when you want to know it. And we're adjusting to that. I think newspapers are critical to a democracy because of the role they play in communities. I worked for a network news organization. You didn't hear me talking about any healing that we provided for the Columbine community. That's what local newspapers do. A big concern of mine moving forward is with social media, because so far the big social media entities have said they're platforms, but they're not publishers, and they don't have the obligations that newspapers or television news organizations have to really be responsible in what they report. And until that changes, we're going to still be in this chaotic time. But I hope at some point we'll come through this, and there will be a new form of local news coverage that people will have access to because it is so important to have accountability of government and have the news where you live and know what's going on.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who asked questions here tonight. Have a good night, everyone.